Christ is in our midst. Welcome to Blessed Darkness. How is everybody today?
Right.
Great.
Wonderful, wonderful. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse every sin, save our souls, O gracious Lord. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint for today. And so talking a little bit about the path. So the path is sort of the second half of the book in which we are looking at collected memoirs of those who knew Father Arseny. Now, obviously, the first half was also taken from memoirs of those who knew Father Arseny. Some of them were from Father Arseny himself, but this is largely from his spiritual children. Some of it's taking place after the camp, some of it's taking place before the camp. And to me, it reminds me of a little bit of like Acts of the Apostles, because the very first chapter of the path is basically the continuation of the story after his emancipation from the Gulag. I'm going to silence my phone. One of my spiritual children is texting me. There we go. So this is going to begin with I Remember. And in it, it is talking about Father Arseny's return to civilization, where he meets the wife of one of the prisoners that he was with named Pavlov. So can you all tell me about a little bit about how this section struck you, how the introduction to where he would spend the last 15 years of his life affected everyone?
Well, he was kind of in shock, really, when he first got out, which I'm sure anybody getting out of prison, or like when we got out of the military, it was a shock to get into a different society.
Right. I mean, obviously, within military, you're within a microcosm of, orders, and it's its own little culture. But of course, prison is a completely different animal.
Yeah.
It's not as, it's barbarism in the prison. Yeah. We see about it a little bit later, and it's almost like this: you're leaving a life in which you were living like a wild animal almost, and not knowing what to do. And we see this in quite a bit of things. One of the most striking and sad scenes from Shawshank Redemption was when that individual was released from prison and ultimately committed suicide because he just did not know how to live in life after basically 50 years in prison. So Father Arseny is in shock after all, seeing Monastery Avenue, River Drive changed to Soviet Drive, and what have you. Is like, you don't know where anything is. And this was where he had spent a number of years of his life serving in a parish. And so he goes up to a house and he rings the bell. And obviously we are all thinking as the readers that he's going to one of his spiritual children. He's going to house with somebody that he knows. And what does he encounter? Who does he encounter?
There's nobody there.
Well, first there's nobody there, but eventually she answers the door. And who is she? Oh, excuse me, not she. That's right. She meets him at the bench. But who is she?
Oh, she's the wife. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead and answer, Vicky.
I didn't say anything. It wasn't me.
Oh, she's the wife of one of the she's the wife of
Pavlov. Yes.
Of Pavlov, who Father Arseny knew well. And did he ask for him to go see her?
Correct. He said that I want you to watch after my wife, look after her. Like many of Father Arseny's spiritual children, Pavlov was an atheist that ultimately came to believe in God through Father Arseny, and wanted Father Arseny to take care of his wife. And so Father Arseny, before he was released from prison, was corresponding with Nora, but she was still an atheist. So the only reason she was basically doing this, having Father Arseny in her home, was because it was a kindness to her husband. But as we see, what happens over time, a relatively quick time if you think about it.
Well, this is a sad story behind her.
Yes.
Also, but she became, a Christian, but she was an atheist.
Correct. Well, what more about her? Because there was a lot about her.
Well, she was a dedicated. Well, she joined the party at like 15 or 16,
Mm-hmm.
and
She was dedicated. She was published.
She was published, a very famous publisher, and I guess as many of the people in the camp were, somebody lied about her. They arrested her and her husband, I guess, at the same time. She lost her children. Her children went to the orphanage. It's a very sad story, really. One of the children died at the orphanage. The other was conscripted in the army and died in the army battles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the daughter did marry.
Yes.
And bought the house. Her husband and she bought the house for the mother, but she was still an atheist, in my understanding, wasn't she?
Correct. She was still an atheist. She was stayed in the town. She did not return to Moscow because she wanted to be near where her youngest child died and was buried. And so she brought Father Arseny into her house. And now, as you said, she had a very sad life. And what happens when we have that kind of sadness and we don't have God? What was happening to her?
She was in despair.
She was in extreme despair. I mean, it was very graphic. She wanted to slam her head against the floor. She was biting her pillow as she was screaming in rage, impotent rage, at why did this happen to me? Why have I lost everything? And she wanted to die, but she didn't want to die. And so she wanted basically to vent out her frustrations. And so what did she do?
Did she ask Father Arseny at that
Well,
point?
she went in to talk to him.
Yeah, she went in not to talk to him. She went in to kind of, tell him off and, just kind of vent herself. But what did she encounter instead?
She realized, well, Father Arseny seemed to know her story. He seemed to know, but that he told her that everything that happened was really her fault.
Well, we're jumping ahead a little bit, and this is where the glory of God is powerful. In fact, I'm going to read from what Nadezhda heard as Father Arseny was praying.
Oh yes, that's right.
It said, so she said, I was upset. I had walked in rudely, not knocking. He didn't even turn around. I stopped and distinctly heard the words of his prayer being so clearly pronounced. O my beloved Queen, my hope, O Mother of God, protector of orphans and protector of those who are hurt. So her children were orphans. She is hurting. The savior of those who perish. She's upset about her children dying. And the consolation of all those who are in distress. And this is the most important part. You see my misery. You see my sorrow and my loneliness. Help me. I'm powerless. Give me strength. You know what I suffer. You know my grief. Lend me your hand, because who else can be my hope but you, my protector and my intercessor before God? I have sinned before you and before all people. Be my mother, my consoler, my helper. Protect me and save me. Chafe grief away from me. Chase my lowness of heart and my despondency. Help me, O Mother of God. Now, given what she was going through, the pain, the sorrow, the agony, is it any wonder that even as an atheist, the words of that prayer became indelibly written on her heart to where she could never, ever, ever forget those words? Because it was as if that prayer was written for her in that moment, and that the Mother of God was speaking to her through Father Arseny, and that's when she began to sob and gave what in the church is called a life confession. So when you establish yourself with a spiritual father, what you often will do is you will give what's known as a life confession. You tell your whole life, warts and all, to the priest, so that the priest has an idea of who you are, your journey, and where you're going, so that he is better able to help you and guide you. And so she does that. She leaves nothing out, not even realizing that she's giving a life confession to the priest before she even becomes a Christian. But she's so desperate for help, and part of that is for him to hear her story, to understand, for her to vent out what is happening to her. Now, obviously, psychology will look at that and say, oh, well, there's catharsis in vocalizing and getting your pain out in the open to just kind of cleanse the wounds. But it's more than that. There's spiritual prayer in that, and that Father Arseny was there and present for her in that moment. Now, despite all that, did Father Arseny want to stay with her?
No.
No, because she was an atheist, and he was a priest. And
now, before we get further than that, because it almost sounds like he's at least she's an atheist. Get away with her. No. Why was that a problem?
Well, he said he was going to have all kinds of people coming to visit him.
Yeah.
He was going to have people visiting. He was going to be doing church service, and he felt that would bother her. That would be an annoyance to her.
So it was more that he was concerned for her.
Correct.
sake.
He was thinking, like, you're inviting me into your house. You have to understand, with me comes baggage. And if you're not okay with that, you're not going to like it. And of course, he does leave, and he goes to stay with one of his other spiritual children. What kind of house was that?
Oh.
Well, she was old and
Sounded like it was
needed
pretty
help herself.
Yeah,
and-
and
Exactly.
pretty dilapidated, and he was in a room that was the size of a closet.
Correct. And so...
The lady wanted to help, though. I mean, but
Correct.
she was older and really couldn't physically.
But she was one that was looking at the atheist and saying,
Yeah.
I don't want him staying with you.
Yeah, right. Because she was an atheist.
And
Whereas
yet-
father, it wasn't that way.
Exactly, because Father Arseny does not see people in those kind of classes, but just as people and wants to help.
Yeah, they made a point of that in the readings that he helped people in the camp, no matter if they were good or what we would consider good or bad or anything. He just saw them as God's children.
So then we see that a guest comes, a man named Nikolai. And it's a friend of hers from the past, someone that knew her husband. And, they're reminiscing about her husband. Then he notices a coat in the hallway. He's like, oh, someone's living with you. You've moved on.
He was married.
Yeah, exactly. Have you remarried? Who's staying with you? And then she gives his non-ecclesial name, Piotr, and not Father Arseny. Of course, he suddenly recognizes, oh my God, it's
Yeah.
Father Arseny.
Yeah, gets all excited.
And because, again, he was somebody that was in the camps with Pavlov, and while Pavlov did not survive, Nikolai did. Now, why did Nikolai, at the time Pavlov, become so attached to Father Arseny? What happened in the camp that endeared them to him?
They lived in the same barracks with him for over a year.
Eventually they lived in there, but before that Nikolai just thought that he was just, a dumb priest, and then thought, well, whatever. But they were going to do something, and he convinced them not to.
Yeah, he was going to commit suicide?
No,
No,
that's
they
not-
were going to try to escape.
Oh, trying to
And-
escape. That's right. That was
And
the
Father
other one.
Arseny talked Pavel and he out of trying
Yeah.
to escape
Because they would be killed.
because they would be
Because
killed.
it was impossible
It was
to
a-
escape.
They had never told anybody how Father Arseny knew that they were going to escape was beyond him.
Right, and we're going to see that a little bit later in the reading. So somehow he intrinsically knew what they were planning to do and stepped in at the right moment to save their lives. Now, ultimately, obviously, Pavlov did die physically. Of course, he was saved ultimately, and that's one of the reasons why he sends Father Arseny with the desperate idea of save my wife. Now, obviously, she would have thought, okay, well, this is to take care of her, but the reality was it was not about that. Obviously, she was the one that was going to take care of him physically, but he wanted her saved. He wanted her soul to be saved, and of course, that happens within 5 months. And it even says at the end of the chapter that she wasn't by that point, she was already a spiritual daughter of Father Arseny. She was upset with Nikolai because he'd been rude to her. But then, of course, she recognized, like, okay, I get it now.
Yeah, because you came to visit me, and off you go, spending all the time with him.
So-
That's what the impression was.
So basically, Nadezhda becomes the almost the vehicle of our stories now, because now she is the one that is housing him, and so now all these different people and all these different authors are going to come in and talk. So the next person that we're going to hear from is a girl named Tatiana. Now, what about Tatiana?
That the next chapter?
That's the next chapter. And so Tatiana is this young girl who's a spiritual child, and she's basically talking about all of these characters coming in and meeting with him. And in it, we hear some old faces. So who is the first of the main people that we hear? We hear about Irina. We hear about And now, who's Irina again, if you recall? She's tall, she's statuesque. Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems cold, but she's actually this famous doctor.
Famous doctor. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And so she was the one that was friends with Vera that got us to Abrazimov, who we're going to talk about in a moment. But the next person that we hear about is an engineer named Sazikov. Now, who is Sazikov? Do we remember?
Yeah, he was a great part of the other part of the story while he was in camp.
Correct. Sazikov represents the leader of the bandits clique of the Gulag.
He was very evil before, right? He was the
Correct.
murderer, thief, and
Correct. He had done all these terrible things, and he was kind of a dichotomy to Greybeard, in the sense that Greybeard never repented and died in agony, whereas Sazikov repented, changed, and of course became this wonderful person, to the point that Tatiana did not believe him when he said, I was a horrible person. I was a bad man.
Right.
And it wasn't until later on that he reveals more to her and kind of basically says, no, this did happen. But he was so good, so full of life and beauty and handsome, that she thought that there's no way that this man could possibly be like that.
Oh, Father, I recall when they comparing the two, when the one died who did not repent, I mean, how his eyes looked versus the other who, you could see when he died that his eye, that like his soul was going to heaven, that you could see that his happiness.
Correct, and that's who we're going to end with the Mikhail, the monk. The next person that we meet is, and this is a little case of how things went, is that when people would come to Father Arseny, no names were really given unless explicitly stated by Father Arseny. So everyone's privacy wasn't kept. Now this was for two reasons. One, of course, it was because obviously within spiritual life, your sins are your sins and your business. It's nobody's business what your life is and what you're going through. It's like when you're going to a therapist. You know, it's nobody's business in the room, in the waiting room, what you're there to see the therapist about, or what your connection is to the therapist. So unless, connections were made by Father Arseny to you to say, hey, I want to introduce you, you didn't know who they were. So one individual came in who was this statuesque man, very clearly a military man, with black hair and a mustache. And who is he?
Was he the general that got reinstated?
Yes, he was. That was, at the time, he was called the Major, the one that was in charge. He was the one that snuck Father Arseny the letters for Azankov.
Oh, yeah.
And basically also an atheist, but became to believe because of what had happened, how Vera had saved his wife and child when his child was sick, and basically continued to do everything he could to first get Azankov out, but also to try to alleviate the suffering of Father Arseny. And so Tatiana is introduced, and apparently Father Arseny senses something between the two of them, because he says, when I am gone, do not leave him. So in other words, he's telling Tatiana, you're going to take care of Abrazimov.
Yeah.
And when he tells Abrazimov, when I die, you're going to find another priest. Now, we can guess who the other priest is from the very next page.
Yeah.
Yes, Father Alexei. Now, who is Father Alexei? Or Alosha, as he's affectionately known.
He was the student in the camp?
He was the student. He was the young student. Now, what was his story in the camp? Do you recall?
Yeah, but wasn't he the one that was with him in
the box?
Oh, yeah.
When it's 42 below zero?
Correct. He is the one who, in the midst of the liturgy, essentially, survived what should not have been survivable. The young student who was beaten to half to death.
He needed to jump up and down, but he couldn't jump up and
Exactly, it's because he'd basically been beaten half to death, so he couldn't jump. He was like, okay, we're dead. And so when he had experienced that miracle, obviously touched it, and he became, for all intents and purposes, Father Arseny's puppy. He would follow him everywhere, and so he was one of Father Arseny's spiritual children that when Abrazimov was going to be reassigned, he basically said, give me a list of the names of the people that absolutely have to be released, in addition to Azankov, and of course Sazikov was one, and Aloysha. Alexei, the student, were those. And so Alexei, of course, became a priest and became a priest of the parish that Father Arseny served. So it is, we see this kind of spiritual progression of spiritual fatherhood to spiritual fatherhood. in which Alexei became the spiritual father to many of the people that we see here.
Father, I had a question. I know what they said about, the Father Alexei went to serve in the church that Father Arseny did, but why didn't Father Arseny, when he came back, serve in the church?
By that point, he had been kind of broken, and so he was serving in his rehabilitation. So if you have to recall, when he first got there, he had said, "Oh, I'm going to have visitors, I'm going to have guests," and
he had nobody.
And he had nobody.
Yeah,
it wasn't until Nikolai came and slowly, because he was still being rehabilitated.
Oh, okay.
Because remember,
okay.
Alexei had been in there for a couple of years, same with Ivankov and all those. He was in there a while. Years and years and years. And so it talks about it here, how he was, for all intents and purposes, people would look at him and they'd think, oh, he's healthy and strong, and not realizing he's actually very sick. And so it would be Irini and the other doctors that would come visiting that would basically force him on occasion to go to Moscow against his wishes to basically go to the clinic, because they did see that, he was still a broken man. I mean, he had endured torture. He had endured things that no human being could possibly endure, but he somehow endured them. He's not superhuman. He's not something that's other than human. He is a human being. And we see this with many of the saints that, yes, they did amazing things. They were still human, and they still suffered. Okay, we meet again. Now, this is a fun story because it's basically about high school buddies. Now, what is this about? This author is someone that went to school with Father Arseny. And what happened to him?
They knew each other in high school, and then they went off to different colleges. They weren't really good friends, but
they were close enough.
Close enough.
And so he understood Father Arseny, went to become an art major, wrote some books. He himself went on to write many books. So they're both basically intellectuals. They went to the school that basically, reared them to be in the intelligentsia. But when Father Arseny was a young priest, it kind of confused him. He's like, I never had any inkling that he was going to become a priest. And then something happens to him that crushes him. What happened to him?
Well, he fell in love with this woman and he married her. He's madly in love, but unfortunately, she leaves him. And I think she actually married a friend.
So here's the thing.
His best friend.
His best friend.
So, and you have to be careful with your words here, because you say he was madly in love with her, but as we're about to discover, not really.
Right.
Because he's broken, he's upset, his pride is destroyed because his best friend, one of his buddies, married this girl that he thought that he was in love with. Yeah. So he goes to the church. Sees Father Arseny, and Father Arseny says, "What's wrong?" Like, he immediately knows something's wrong, and the man tries to play it off like, "Nothing's wrong. I'm just here by coincidence." Meanwhile, of course, drink is on his breath, and it's like 10 in the morning. He's drunk in the morning. He's clearly upset, and so Father Arseny has his brother priest, Father Ioan, finish services. All right, let's go to my house. We're going to talk, and there he learns about everything. And his first words to his friends, instead of like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you went through that," was, "This is your fault."
Right. Yeah. Didn't console him at all.
But why was it his fault? What did he do?
He did not pay attention to his wife or her needs.
It wasn't just his wife or her needs, but nothing about her. He didn't pay any attention to her hopes, her dreams, her aspirations. She's a human being, and what happens sometimes in marriage is that you almost look at your spouse as an attaché, an accessory almost, as opposed to a human being with needs, wants, desires, and a future. He didn't pay any attention to that. And so of course she left him, because he wasn't giving her anything that she needed. And so he said, "This is your fault." Now, one could say that if that would have been done to you, you'd be like, "Oh, well, you know what? I got some choice words for you." And he did have choice words for Father Arseny, but then he realized it was a mistake. And he stayed with Father Arseny 3 days and came away feeling better. And so then it said that he was his priest, but he was also his best friend because he didn't leave him. He stayed with him. And so when Father Arseny went to the Gulag, of course, it was devastating for him because he thought, my friend is gone, my friend is dead. And so he was one of these people that they were talking about, the spiritual children that were desperately looking for him, desperately hoping that he was alive. And that's why we have that secondary chapter in this, in which he describes him going to Father Arseny. And it's, how would you describe that section in which it's a first-person dialogue in what it's like going to meet Father Arseny? He's like giddy with excitement. It's almost like he's going to meet his idol, and he's so happy, and yet he's anxious, full of anxiety. Why is he full of anxiety? It's essentially, why is he going to Father Arseny? Why do most of these people go to Father Arseny?
A lot of them kind of go for confession.
Exactly right. That's what most of these spiritual gurus that we hear about, Father Elder Paisios, Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios, Elder Thaddeus, who will probably be canonized. In this case, Father Arseny. People are going there for confession so that they can go confess their sins and be relieved. And he knows that's what's going to happen. He knows that he's going to feel better, but at the same time, he's embarrassed because he's going to have to confess some sins. And what happens when he is having difficulty confessing his sins?
Is this where Father Arseny seems to know his sins and sort of finishes his sentences for him where he's having difficulty?
Well, he says, why did you do that? Why did you hurt that man so? And of course, that's when his friend says, oh, I knew that you were going to tell me that. I was anxious to tell you. But then, of course, kind of how with Sazakov, when Sazakov's confession was stalling and Father Arseny kind of filled in the blanks. Now, what's interesting is his friend mentions this to him and says, we've all noticed that, a bunch of you priests, you seem to be clairvoyant and able to read minds. And what does Father Arseny say to him?
No, it's that any priest who knows their children and their soul should be able to, like he is clairvoyant, but he's not. He's
hiding the charisma from them, but basically he does have it, and they're very aware of it. But what he's comparing it to is the idea of a mother knows what her child is thinking, and that has nothing to do with clairvoyance or mind reading. It just has to do with a parent knows, if they truly love their child, knows what's going on in their child's life, knows what their struggles are, and is able to accurately pinpoint what is going on, what's happening, and what they've probably done. Now, of course, that's a bunch of hooey. Father Arseny does know.
Yes. Right.
But he's doing that because, again, these are not things that he wants to showcase, and because he's basically trying to give the idea of what is a miracle. And so they're looking at him, this is this miraculous person, this miraculous contemporary of theirs, and all these things are happening. And what is he talking about? What is the real miracle in the eyes of Father Arseny?
This, like, you're putting everything in God's hands, and he's more or less orchestrating.
Mm-hmm. So he says, and it is only by understanding things in this way that a man can see the will of God. Many inventions which I participated amazed me, and I said to myself, but this is a miracle. But then when I realized my own nothingness, I understood that it is not for me to see a miracle. Everything in life is a miracle. The main miracle is that by the will of God, man lives on earth. Believe in this. And so the idea here is that miracles are all around us.
Right.
When we open up our eyes, everything becomes a miracle. We're able to understand that God's presence with us is a miracle. It's a miraculous thing. And so he's trying to get his spiritual children not to focus on these supernatural elements, because ultimately, is that going to help anybody? Is that going to bring them closer to God? No, because then they're looking for the supernatural. They're looking for these mystical realities, the guru that can do these things, as opposed to the simple reality that he is trying to be a vehicle to bring people to God. And so let's go to the next one, letters, excerpts from the memoirs of O.S. Now, what do we notice about the letter writing that he is doing?
That Father Arseny is doing?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he goes. It's like spends a lot of time. Sometimes he's in prayer, and that he'll put it down even, and then come back to it later, because he does waiting for the right words. Somehow God, through him, is writing the right things. And sometimes he'll answer things that wasn't the question. Is that where he's being, or is that later?
No, this is.
Okay, where I forgot who was hearing him, and Father would dictate, and then he'd dictate an answer that wasn't the question, and then the person would write back, "Oh, thank you. That's exactly, like how you helped me," even though that, he can't answer, but it wasn't the question. He didn't answer the question. He answered what that person needed.
Correct. And so what we see with him is that even though he's seeing hundreds and hundreds of people, he's also receiving all these letter correspondence. And instead of saying, okay, well, I can only do so much, he still takes the time for each and every letter to take time and look at it and read it and pray about it. And so he intercedes to the Mother of God to help these people, to help them understand. And something that he does that which more of us would do, especially with emails, because obviously, he was using snail mail back in the in the 60s and 1950s, is that oftentimes when we write things, we think we just want to send it immediately. And one thing that I've been told, and I think it's a very, very important tact, is when you write something emotional, doesn't matter what the emotion is, but especially anger. If you write something heated, wait 2 days before you send it. Pray about it. And when you read it after those 2 days, oftentimes one of two things will happen. Either you'll read it and go, well, hang on a second, that's a little bit much. I need to rewrite this. Or what can happen is or you might just say, you know what, I'm not going to send that at all, because I'm thinking better of it. And so it's very, very important to pray and pause, to take time to do things slowly. Okay.
Who was OS? I forgot.
So OS is somebody that did not want to have their name written.
Oh, okay.
So this is somebody that basically was observing his letter writing and experienced his letter writing. And so, of course, this also person tells you kind of what you had said in the previous one. When you would come to confession and start to tell about yourself, he would sometimes interrupt and finish your sentences for you, or he would answer the question you had not even asked yet, or tell you his opinion about your actions. Sometimes I would just come into his room, and he would greet me by saying, "I did not expect you would have an argument with your brother because of your mother. I did not expect this. You are closer to your mother than he is. You are the one who must be understanding." I would just remain standing in front of him, wishing the floor would open and swallow me up. I was so ashamed.
Yeah. And
so in this we also see that these people, his spiritual children, especially those that are coming later, see that Father Arseny has a extreme attachment to his spiritual children and friends from the camp. And this is, of course, because of the shared suffering. They're basically warriors in faith that survive something incredible with one another. And we see this oftentimes with the categories of saints, where oftentimes we hear about the main saint and those martyred with him. Because they were not alone. There were others that martyred there, and they were together, and they were friends together.
I found it interesting too that they said, like, sometimes, like, they thought, I'm the only one, I'm his best friend, and then they think about it and realize that he has hundreds, but I guess he made each individual feel.
Correct. And this is where I love what in the next section, returning from the past, in which the individual says his friends loved him, but when they came to see him or wrote pages and pages to him, each of them thought that he was the only one to do so. All this resulted in an enormous load on Father Arseny, so that although we loved him, it's possible that we were unintentionally destroying him.
That felt sad.
And so this is one of the things where we saw that he is not just staying there, sitting on a hut, or rather in Nadezhka's house, but he would also visit his spiritual children. And so he goes to see one of his spiritual children, and one of the journeys, he goes to see this individual named Sergei. Now, what is Sergei's story? Why is he going to see Sergei?
Let's go see him.
And at first Sergei is happy to see him until Father Arseny mentions, I'm here on behalf of Mikhail.
Right.
Now again, who was Mikhail?
The monk.
The monk who took the last confession.
Yeah, exactly. Who took the last confession, and Father Arseny said, this light was such a bright light that I cannot believe I was able to witness it. And this was something that he experienced shortly after his own near-death experience, in which the Panagia allowed him to see all of the stellar lights of the camp. And then he's introduced to Mikhail right before he dies. And of course, how did Mikhail's corpse get treated?
Oh, like garbage. They just sort of threw him on. It was hard. The guard came and kicked him to see if he was dead, and then threw him on the cart, and they just, took him off on top of the other bodies. It was terrible.
Mm-hmm. And so Sergei is here, and he wants them to leave. Now, why does he want them to leave?
He thinks that they're lying. That he's from the I don't want to say Gestapo, but that in the Russian
KGB.
the KGB or something.
Right.
I didn't want to say that he was knowing Father Arseny or knowing.
Now, why would Sergei be kind of nervous about that? Because what is in Sergei's office?
What was in Sergei's office? Oh, wait. An icon of the Theotokos that was...
Not just one. There were several.
Several, but
there were several icons.
Yes.
Which he has there, and the way he's able to have them is he's treating them almost like...
pieces of art.
Pieces of art.
Right.
And what convinces him that Father Arseny is legitimate?
Well, Father Arseny asked to hold the icon, and at first he doesn't want to do it, and then he gives it to him, and Father Arseny places it on the table, and the light comes and shines on the Theotokos in such a way that he had illumined her, and he had never seen that, and it touched him so much.
Exactly right. And even before that, the way that he was cradling the icon, as if he was holding the body of Christ himself, as he was laying it so reverently on the table. And so prayerfully, this illuminated in a way that basically brought the Panagia into the room and illuminated it for Sergei. And so they do kind of a testing thing. Oh, who painted it?
Right.
And what do we see from this?
That basically it doesn't matter who or when it was painted.
And so this was the answer.
It was because it was prayerfully done.
When was it painted? In the beginning of the 17th century. Where? Who was its iconographer? God alone knows. The God who inspired the artist. The board is very old and has been painted over many times, one icon on top of the other. The last icon restored but a very long time ago. All this is totally unimportant because the Spirit of God lives in this icon. Look what peace radiates from the faces of both the Mother and the Son. The icon painter was full of love and faith in Christ, so that he increased his talent by faith and love. That is why the face of the Mother is so spiritual and so real that it consoles all who are oppressed by the sorrow and sadness. Those who are deprived, naked, orphaned, imprisoned, those who have almost lost faith in human justice, those who are weak, it gives life to such people. It restores their hope. It reminds them that there exists another life, free from horror and fear, from blood and the evils of this world. The face of the Mother of God calls us and gives us the hope of salvation. And so this little homily that he gives on the icon moves Sergei, and that is when Elizaveta comes in and basically talks about the reality of who Father Arseny is. And she basically knows exactly who he is.
Very excited.
And so, meeting a friend of Mikhail, what does that do for Father Arseny? How does he feel about this?
He
Remember,
lifts him.
I don't know if I'm going to let Zoom user guest in since they're not giving a name. That's the nice thing about the waiting room is you don't have to necessarily let people in that might be trying to just bomb the place.
Oh, goodness.
Well, we've recalled that habit with one of our Bible studies.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, he stayed with him 4 days.
4 days.
And so on the way back home, Father Arseny said to me, "The way of God are mysterious. How much beauty this meeting has given me. It makes me give me much of what I needed." So this was something for Father Arseny because it wasn't just the fact of being a spiritual guide to Sergei and those that were friends of Mikhail that needed a new guide in the spirit, but Father Arseny needed this as well. So now let's go to the next chapter.
You know, Father, sometimes you see in church, sometimes the sun will come down, right? We've noticed that a lot of times in church, the sun will come down and illumine, you know, either the icon or the altar, and it just looks magnificent. You think, wow.
So the last section we're going to talk about today is I Remember. And this is one that takes place within the days of the camp. And what happens in it? Whose perspective is it?
It's Father Arseny's, wasn't it?
It's not from Father Arseny's perspective. It's from a prisoner that came to camp who was experiencing great suffering, and he made a decision. He decided that with all the suffering, with all the screaming, with all the things, and the reality that he could be killed by guards, killed by mobsters, killed by the weather, what decision he says, well, I'm not going to let them decide my death. I'm going to decide it. I'm going to end it. I'm going to take control of my life. And so he's resolute and he decides, I'm going to do this. And so he sees, you know, this man standing by his bunk all the time, standing there. And then suddenly the man starts walking with him as he's determined to walk out to do what he's going to do. And what happens?
He stops him, gets his arm, and stops him and wants to talk to him. He doesn't say, how did he say that, how did he word that? Okay, you remember?
He takes me by the arm and says, "Sit down. You are not alone here. There are many of us who feel the way you do, but God is with us." Now, what does this teach us? Why is this here? It is here because when we're in despair, when we're hurting, if we don't have God with us, then yes, it's very easy to despair. Well, there's nothing left for me. But Father Arseny is showing that even in those moments, especially in those moments, we are not alone.
God gives us strength.
Exactly.
And it sounded like that beam was a place that many prisoners before had hung themselves.
Correct.
The impression I got.
It was a suicide spot. And so Father Arseny basically tells him, you know, yes, I'm sick, exhausted, hurt, despised, hungry, yet all of this can be vanquished, must be vanquished, and if I so choose, victory will be mine. So in other words, he's telling him, don't give up. Now, does Father Arseny push religion on him?
No, he did not.
No,
he mentioned God.
He mentions God, but he doesn't push God on him. He's trying to give the impression someone cares. And what this man sees and understands from Father Arseny is that, you know, as this man did and as others did, people are in cliques and they see other people and they would help people, but only if they were in their clique.
Right.
And then even then, very rarely. He said that you would see people that on the outside would be, you know, could say, I'm virtuous, I'm kind, I'm this, but then on the inside they'd sell out their own mother in a heartbeat for any kind of favor. And so you see basically people broken down to their base elements. And it's a very, very ugly thing. And yet Father Arseny never did that. He continued to love people and treat them as individuals no matter what.
And help everyone.
And so we skip ahead now and we go to after the camp, and he talks about when you go into Father Arseny's room, and he kind of gives a breakdown of the room of Father Arseny. And in it, what do we notice?
He has the icons.
He has the icons.
Doesn't have too much. There's a window opening to the garden, and he has a sofa. But what confused me is he didn't have a bed in there. He slept on the sofa.
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, that's pretty rough. I guess we're spoiled.
I mean, he was a monastic. I mean, he would spend a lot of times basically standing in prayer.
Oh, I remember too. He had the icons, he had the Bible and spiritual books, and he had lots of other books, including books on atheism.
And why did he say that he had those? Why did he say that it was necessary to have books on atheism?
Because in today's world, you need to be, as a priest, you needed to, and even today I would assume that you need to be not living in just with the Bible, which is all you theoretically need, but to know what other people are, reading and thinking. Like if you're going to talk with an atheist and see, I forgot the name of it, something like they see it in atheism, but what they believe, or and also different subjects as well. So he could on the same. Of course, he was very educated anyway, but to be able to talk to people, whether they were blue collar or highly educated in art or history or whatever it was, including the book on atheism, so that he would have an understanding of where they were coming from.
Correct. And so what this is all getting at, and kind of what Father Arseny was talking about to him, was what we leave must be remembered, whether it's a book, whether it's an action. It's not a matter about what it is, but just that we leave the world a little better than we received it. That all of us are going to leave a mark. All of us are going to leave some sort of legacy. And so this is where a lot of the secondary tier of like what he has in his room, what are the physical adornments that we see there, to understand what he is leaving behind. And so the final interaction that he really gives us is an interaction between Father Arseny and a bishop. And this bishop came and he said, stayed for 2 days, during which time he confessed to Father Arseny and also heard his confession. They talked about the fate of the future of the church in the Soviet Union, about what was important for believers. Looking at Father Arseny's library, he pronounced, the faithful one needs only the gospel, the Bible, and the works of the Holy Fathers. All the rest isn't worth his attention. Father Arseny remained silent for a few moments and answered, you are right, Your Grace. The most important things are in those books. But we must remember that man, as he develops nowadays, is very different from a man in the 4th century. The horizon of knowledge has become wider, and science can now explain what couldn't be understood then. The priest today must know a great deal in order to be able to help believers make sense of the contradiction he sees. A priest has to understand the theory of relativity, passionate atheism, the newest discoveries in biology, medicine, and most of all, modern philosophy. He gets visited by students of medicine, chemistry, physics, as well as by blue-collar workers, and each one of them has to be given an answer to his or her question such that religion doesn't sound anachronistic or just a half answer. So in other words, Father Arseny, even from back then in the 60s, was basically given the answer that a lot of modern theologians have said, just saying because Father said so is not enough. You have to be able to eloquently state why something is, not only by saying St. John Chrysostom says it, St. Basil says it, but able to contextualize it in today's society and use their own language, I'm not going to say against them, but in a manner that they understand it, to be able to say, okay, what you're doing is anachronistic. What you're talking about is hypocrisy, and here is why. Because otherwise, as they tried to do to Father Arseny in the camp, they're just going to think, oh, you're just an idiot that doesn't understand things. It'll be like Marxist philosophy that says that religion is the opiate of the masses because you're too stupid to understand philosophy. That's why you cling to God. And you need to be able, if you're a priest, to be an apologetic of that. For the faithful, that's not as important, but the priest has to have that information, has to have that knowledge. And so that's why you see bishops all over the world that have doctorates in not just theology, but in, like, for example, our Metropolitan Nathaniel has a doctorate in bioethics because these things are critical to the understanding of the world we live in and the moral complexities that come with it and how things change based on what we understand about the world today, while understanding that theology and the dogmatic principles of the church are timeless. So with the last couple of minutes of class, Does anyone have any questions on the first half of the path?
I don't know if I have any questions, but I will tell you that when I was growing up, which I guess, I was born in the 40s, you figure in the 60s and such, in the 50s. I mean, it just was the priest, everything's accepted. You got a question, you just accept it. Your parents told you, you don't question the priest. And then I remember I went to a clergy laity where I can't remember who the Archbishop was of America at the time. Terrible. Anyway, he said he wanted his priests educated so that they could be, explaining everything. And I noticed that, now, with priests are going to Holy Cross, they get their Masters of Divinity, they're more knowledgeable in being able, Father Simon, we have a Bible study, you ask him a question, he's able to, answer it and in understanding, so we all understand. We just don't just accept everything.
One of my parish council presidents, when I was in Sioux City, Maria Schultz, often told me, we live in the why generation.
Right, exactly.
Why this, why that? And if you can't give an answer as to why, you've got a problem. Because no one is going to accept because anymore. As a parent, that's a lazy parenting tactic to say to a child, why? Well, because. Well, that works for a 3-year-old. But when someone becomes an adult or a teenager, where they're able to conceptualize and understand and rationalize their own destiny, that doesn't work anymore. Now, yes, we can be in our 90s and still be spiritually simple. And by simple, I don't mean agnos, pure simple. I mean like we don't understand anything because we somehow never got it. But that doesn't mean that we lack the ability to have rational thought. And so we should not be patronized because we don't understand something. If anything, that's going to turn someone off. That's going to turn them away. And so you have to be able to speak simple to the simple, with education to the educated, and do it in a simple, humble manner where you're not belittling or making someone feel stupid for not knowing something. Because the reality is there's still a lot we don't know. I'm always reminded of that story of St. Augustine where he was on the beach seeing a little boy dig a hole on the surface. And he sees the boy go to the ocean, take a spoon, go back to the hole, plop the spoon in, go back and forth about 30 times. And meanwhile, St. Augustine was trying to understand the concept of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God. How does that work? What does that mean? And so he's not getting any closer to his answer, so he goes to the boy and says, what are you doing? And the child says, well, I'm going to put the entire ocean in this hole. And Augustine looks at the vastness of the ocean, points to the boy and says, my child, you can't even see the end of the ocean. There is no way you can put it all in that little hole. It's just beyond your scope. You can't do it. The boy turns around as an angel now, tall, and says, and neither can you understand the extent of the Godhead with your human mind. It is impossible. It is more vast than any ocean could ever be. And so that idea that no matter how much we think we know, we don't know. And so it's very, very important that what little we do know, we understand is to be expressed with faith and love. Because ultimately we're supposed to be vehicles, not the arbitrators of truth. All right, well, I hope everyone had... Oh,
I had one thing that struck me early on. It says, I can't remember which one was saying this. Tatiana, yeah. Many times I prayed with Father Arseny. We stood in the twilight room. The oil lamps would be shining on the icons. Father Arseny would be serving. He read very clearly. You could hear each word. He would be entirely into his prayer, and you who had just gotten off the train and were still carrying the bustle of the city with you, could slowly join in with him, forgetting everything around you, seeing only the icons of the Mother and hearing only the words of the prayer. somewhere inside you would light up with the joy of being united in the great mystery of God's service. But he would read very clearly, just struck me. Because a lot of times in liturgy, when a priest goes through the prayers real quick, they just kind of go over your head. But when the priest is reading very clearly, I mean, it just, whoa, it just jumps out at you.
Mm-hmm. It's very, very important, and especially as a priest, I have to remember this myself, to remember that what you are doing is not a service. And even if you've read those prayers 1,000 times before, every single time you have to remember, this is prayer. This is a sacred moment, every moment. And when you take the time to actually listen to what is being said, what is being expressed, this is why Metropolitan Yaakov of blessed memory said that the greatest classroom is the liturgy. It expresses all of our needs, all of our wants, everything we could possibly need is found in those prayers. And while some priests read them, separately, slowly, other priests read them mystically under their breath while the choir is singing, as is the more traditional custom. So it is incumbent on the lay people, especially if they are able to read their liturgy books, read those prayers. Those mystical prayers that are so critically important. After all, the reason why the petitions came to be was because those prayers were important, but people were talking so much, so they figured, all right, let's figure something to keep the people occupied while the priest prays. That's why the prayers are mystical. They're supposed to be kind of under the breath so that they can focus on the prayer, 100% on the prayer, while the people are focusing on responding to the petitions, which are the little mini prayers of, in peace let us pray to the Lord. Oh, Lord of mercy. That was the whole concept. It was to zero in the people into worship so that the priest can do his mystical job and read those mystical prayers. So some priests, obviously, they pause so that people can hear them and understand them a little bit more. But regardless, you owe it to yourselves to read what those prayers say, because they are truly powerful. All right, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. For those that have celebrated this week, whether you're a Gerasimos, whether you are a Yaakovos or Demetrius, we wish you all Kronia Pola, blessed name days to all, and we pray that you have a blessed, blessed week. Thank you for joining us.
Kronia Pola, Pater.